Homeless black boy saves baby from burning car. His life changes when mother's identity is revealed. Life on the streets was never easy for him. From a young age, he learned to survive alone, invisible to the world that passed by without a second glance. But one unexpected night changes everything: a burning car, a desperate cry, and a decision that could never be undone. In the moment he saved that baby from the flames, he had no idea that he was, in fact, saving himself. The baby's mother, a powerful and mysterious woman, appears to thank him, but something about her doesn't feel right. A hidden secret, an untold truth. As the boy tries to understand the new world around him, he realizes that his heroic act has placed him at the center of something much bigger than he could have imagined. And when the truth about the mother's identity is finally revealed, his life will never be the same. Where are you watching this story from? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. This is another beautiful story from Living Narratives, where you truly feel the emotions of stories that make you reflect on life. The crash came suddenly, metal twisting, glass shattering, and the car slamming violently into the pole with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. The impact was brutal. For a split second, everything seemed still, frozen in that moment of destruction. Then, as if the very air itself had caught fire, flames erupted from beneath the crumpled hood, climbing hungrily along the edges of the vehicle. Inside, there was no movement, no sound, until a faint, desperate cry pierced through the chaos. A baby. There was a baby inside. His body reacted before his mind could process the gravity of the situation. He sprinted toward the burning wreckage, his muscles coiling with urgency. The heat was suffocating, radiating off the metal in waves, but he pushed forward. The car doors were jammed shut from the collision. He pulled, yanked, slammed his fist against the handle, but nothing gave way. The crying inside grew louder, more frantic. His gaze darted wildly, searching for an alternative. Then he saw it, a chunk of concrete near the curb. Without hesitation, he grabbed it, lifted it over his head, and brought it crashing down against the rear window. The glass cracked, but didn't shatter completely. He hit it again, harder, putting every ounce of strength he had into the blow. This time it gave way, shards scattering like deadly confetti. He didn't think about the cuts now lining his arms, the sting barely registering. The smoke was thicker inside, curling into his lungs, making his eyes water. He squinted through the haze, spotting the small, wriggling figure strapped into a car seat. His fingers fumbled with the buckle, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought to free the child. The belt was stuck. He tugged again, harder, feeling the seconds slip away as the fire advanced. The heat was unbearable now, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead, mixing with the dirt and blood on his skin. With a final, desperate jerk, the latch gave way, and the baby tumbled into his arms. He had no time to celebrate. The flames were licking at the back seat, inching closer, consuming everything in their path. He twisted his body, maneuvering back through the shattered window. The metal frame groaned ominously, the entire structure threatening to collapse. He swung his legs over the edge, gripping the baby tightly against his chest. Then he jumped. His feet barely hit the pavement before a deafening explosion sent a shockwave ripping through the air. The force knocked him forward, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body as he hit the rough asphalt, but he held onto the baby, his arms locked in an unyielding grip. His ears were ringing, the world momentarily reduced to a muffled blur of fire and movement. He coughed violently, his lungs burning from the smoke, his body trembling from the sheer adrenaline coursing through his veins. Slowly, painfully, he forced himself up to his knees. He glanced down at the baby, whose cries were still loud and strong, alive. He had made it. The distant wail of sirens grew closer, flashing lights illuminating the growing crowd that had gathered nearby. People were shouting, pointing, their faces a mix of horror and awe. Some rushed toward him, their hands reaching out, but He instinctively pulled back, his grip tightening around the child. He wasn't used to people paying him attention, wasn't used to being at the center of anything other than indifference. And yet, here he was, holding a life that had been moments from vanishing in the flames. Someone, a woman, dropped to her knees beside him, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God, are you okay? Is the baby—" She hesitated, hands trembling as she reached forward. He simply nodded, still unable to form words, still trying to process what had just happened. The baby let out another wail, its tiny fists clenching and unclenching. The woman pressed a hand over her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. You saved them." More people arrived, their voices overlapping in a blur of questions and exclamations. He could hear the pounding of boots on pavement as paramedics rushed toward them. A strong hand landed on his shoulder, and for the first time he realized how cold he felt despite the lingering heat of the explosion. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with one of the emergency responders. "Come with me," the man said firmly, guiding him toward the flashing ambulance. His legs felt like lead, every movement slow, stiff. He could feel the weight of the moment settling onto his chest. The baby had stopped crying now, its tiny face pressed against his torn shirt. He tightened his hold just slightly, reluctant to let go, even as hands reached out to take the child from him. "You're safe now," someone murmured. "You did good, kid." For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew this night had changed everything. The moment the paramedics reached for the baby, a voice cut through the chaotic scene with a sharp, desperate urgency. "Give him to me!" A woman pushed through the gathering crowd, her designer heels clicking against the pavement, her breath uneven as she fought against the people in her way. Her expensive dress clung to her body, a stark contrast to the soot-covered figure holding her child. The boy barely had time to react before she reached out, hands trembling, and pulled the baby from his arms. Her manicured fingers ran over the child's face, touching his tiny hands, confirming that was real, that he was alive. Then, as though she had been holding her breath, she let out a sob so raw, so unfiltered, that even the onlookers seemed to pause. Tears streamed down her face, smudging the perfectly applied makeup that now seemed irrelevant. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice breaking between sobs. "My baby, my baby." She clutched him close, rocking slightly, as if trying to erase the horrifying reality that she had almost lost him forever. The paramedics hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, but the woman barely noticed them. Her attention snapped back to the boy, filthy, bruised, standing there like a ghost. Her sharp eyes softened for a moment as she studied him, as if truly seeing him for the first time. Then suddenly she reached out and grabbed his hand. "Come with me." The boy flinched at her touch, his instincts screaming for him to pull away. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had saved the baby. That was all. He wasn't meant to be part of whatever came next. His pulse pounded in his ears, and for the first time, he became aware of the men surrounding her. They weren't just bystanders. They were dressed in crisp black suits, standing too, still watching too closely. One of them stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "Ma'am, the car is ready." The woman nodded but didn't let go of the boy's wrist. "Come with me," she repeated, this time firmer, more insistent. He hesitated. His entire life had been built on avoiding situations like this. Wealthy people, expensive cars, powerful men who moved like shadows. This wasn't his world. He didn't belong here. But before he could protest, another one of the suited men stepped closer, his towering presence making it clear that refusal wasn't an option. His grip on the boy's shoulder was gentle but firm enough to send a clear message. This wasn't a request. The woman must have seen the hesitation in his eyes because her expression shifted. "You saved my child," she said, voice raw with emotion. "Please let me do something for you." The words felt wrong, out of place. He didn't save the baby for a reward. He didn't even think. He just acted. That was it. And yet, before he could form a response, the security team was already moving, guiding him toward the waiting vehicle. The SUV was sleek, black, the kind of car that screamed power and exclusivity. The back door swung open, smoothly, and the woman climbed in first, cradling her child protectively. One of the men motioned for him to follow. His feet refused to move. Every instinct told him to turn, to run, to disappear back into the city where no one would remember his name. But the moment his gaze met the woman's pleading eyes, something shifted. Against every rational thought, he stepped inside. The door shut with a solid final click. The world outside became distant, muffled. He sank into the plush leather seat, unsure where to place his hands. Everything smelled expensive, the kind of clean, perfumed scent that didn't belong anywhere near someone like him. The baby whimpered softly in the woman's arms, and she stroked his back gently, whispering reassurances. Then, for the first time, she turned to the boy fully, eyes scanning him up and down. "You're hurt," she murmured. He hadn't even noticed. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind the dull ache of bruises, the sting of cuts he hadn't realized he had. His clothes were torn, smudged with dirt, blood, and soot. He looked out of place. No, more than that. He was out of place. The woman reached into a compartment beside her and pulled out a cloth, dabbing at a smudge of ash on his face before he could recoil. "You saved his life," she said softly, her voice calmer now. "I don't even know your name." He stiffened. His name. It had been a long time since anyone had asked for it like it mattered. He considered lying, making something up, but the weight of her gaze told him she wouldn't believe it. He cleared his throat. "Malik," he muttered. The name felt foreign in his own mouth, like something from another life. The woman exhaled slowly, nodding as if committing it to memory. "Malik," she repeated, as if testing the sound. "I'm Olivia." He had no idea what to say to that. Names meant familiarity, connection. This wasn't supposed to be anything. Just a moment. A mistake. The car moved smoothly through the city, the passing lights casting shifting shadows across the tinted windows. His fingers tightened against his lap. He didn't belong here. He had to get out. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, forcing the words out. Olivia hesitated as if she hadn't considered that he might ask. "Somewhere safe," she finally said. That wasn't an answer. He turned toward the door, but one of the suited men sitting near the driver's side gave him a look that made it clear there was no getting out until they reached their destination. Malik's heart pounded. He had made a mistake. This wasn't just gratitude. This was something else entirely. He wasn't sure what he had walked into, but he was sure of one thing. He wasn't in control anymore. The ride was silent, but the tension in the air was thick. Malik sat stiffly in the back seat of the luxurious SUV, his hands clenched into fists against his torn jeans. The soft hum of the engine felt foreign to him, too smooth, too different from the world he knew. Across from him, the woman, Olivia, held the baby close, her fingers stroking the child's tiny head as if reassuring herself that he was really there. Her eyes flicked toward Malik occasionally, studying him, but she said nothing. He didn't know whether to look back or keep his gaze fixed on the window, watching the city. Lights blur as they sped through streets that were far too polished, far too unfamiliar. Everything about this felt wrong, yet he couldn't bring himself to move. The men in suits who sat near the front didn't speak, didn't even glance back at him, but their presence alone made it clear he wasn't getting out until they let him. As the car slowed, Malik saw the towering gates ahead, their intricate design gleaming under the streetlights. They opened smoothly, as if by magic, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with trimmed hedges and statues. The mansion came into view, and his stomach twisted. It was nothing like the shelters he had hidden in, nothing like the abandoned buildings he had curled up inside on freezing nights. This place was pristine, massive, glowing with warm lights from countless windows. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the grand entrance, and one of the suited men stepped out, opening the door for Olivia first. She didn't hesitate, cradling the baby in one arm as she gracefully exited. Then she turned and looked at him expectantly. Malik's body resisted. Every part of him screamed that he didn't belong here, that stepping out meant stepping into something he wouldn't understand. But the alternative was asking to be let go, and something told him that wasn't an option. Steeling himself, he slid out of the car, his scuffed sneakers making the polished stone beneath him feel like another planet. The air smelled different here. Clean, expensive. The large double doors opened before Olivia even reached them, and a row of neatly dressed staff stood inside, their hands folded in front of them, their expressions neutral. Malik's eyes darted between them, searching for something, recognition, curiosity, maybe even hostility. But he found nothing. They were looking past him, through him, as if he didn't exist. The unsettling realization made his skin crawl. He followed Olivia inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around him instantly. But it didn't comfort him. If anything, it made him feel even more out of place. They moved. Through a grand foyer, its chandelier casting reflections along the polished marble floor. The house was too quiet, too still, and every step he took felt like an intrusion. Olivia turned to him, finally breaking the silence. "You need a shower," she said simply, her gaze moving over his dirt-streaked face, his torn clothes. She motioned toward one of the house staff. "Please take him to the guest room, get him fresh clothes." The woman nodded, stepping forward without hesitation. Malik flinched, his body instinctively shifting back. Olivia noticed. "You're safe here," she added, as if that would fix everything. But Malik knew better. Safe wasn't real. Safe didn't exist. The woman led him through a long hallway, past doors that were firmly shut. He tried not to stare, but something about them unsettled him. Why were they locked? What was behind them? The house was massive. He could feel its size in the way his footsteps barely made a sound against the floors, in the way the ceilings stretched impossibly high above him. But despite all that space, there was a strange weight in the air, something invisible pressing against his skin. When they finally reached a door at the end of the hall, the woman pushed it open and gestured for him to step inside. He hesitated, then entered cautiously. The room was immaculate, like something out of a magazine. A large bed with crisp white sheets, a window draped in thick curtains, a closet filled with neatly arranged clothes. Malik swallowed hard. He didn't belong here. He didn't belong anywhere, but especially not here. The woman handed him a towel, nodding toward the adjoining bathroom before silently leaving the room. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the luxury surrounding him, feeling the unfamiliar softness of the towel in his hands. Then, as if on autopilot, he walked into the bathroom and turned on the water. The moment the hot spray hit his skin, he felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had no idea what was happening, why he was here, or what Olivia wanted from him. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about gratitude. After showering and changing into the clothes left for him, Malik stepped back into the bedroom, unsure of what to do next. His old clothes were gone, and he didn't even hear anyone come in to take them. The realization made his stomach twist. Uncomfortably, he moved toward the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it opened easily. Stepping into the hallway, he listened, trying to get a sense of the house, of the people inside it. It was still too quiet, almost unnervingly so. He walked slowly, passing more closed doors, his fingers itching to test their handles. Something was wrong here. He didn't know what, but his instincts told him that this house, despite its beauty, held secrets. As he made his way toward the main staircase, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. A whisper, low, urgent, coming from the end of the hallway. He turned his head slightly, his heart picking up speed. There was a faint glow coming from under a door, slightly ajar. It was Olivia's office. He recognized it from earlier when she had rushed in after arriving. He inched forward, his breath shallow, his pulse thudding against his ribs. As he got closer, he could make out snippets of conversation. A man's voice, rough, serious. Olivia's voice, hushed but sharp. "This isn't what we agreed on," the man was saying. "We don't have a choice," Olivia responded, her tone clipped, controlled. There was a pause. Then the man spoke. "Again, the boy, what are you planning to do with him?" Malik felt his entire body go cold. His instincts had been right. This wasn't just about saving a baby. This was something bigger, and he was right in the middle of it. The pounding on the front door was insistent, a forceful rhythm that sent a tremor through the floor. Malik had barely stepped out of his room when he saw one of the security guards move swiftly across the hallway, his posture rigid, his hand hovering near his belt as if expecting trouble. From position at the top of the staircase, Malik could see Olivia in the grand foyer, standing near the entrance, her body unnaturally still. The way her fingers twitched at her sides told him she already knew who was on the other side of that door. There was no hesitation as the security guard pulled it open, revealing a tall man in a dark suit, his presence commanding the space before he had even stepped inside. The man didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past the guard, his eyes locking onto Olivia with a mixture of fury and urgency. "Where is he?" His voice was rough, demanding, and carried the weight of someone who had no intention of leaving without answers. Olivia's expression barely shifted, but Malik noticed the slight parting of her lips, the faintest tightening of her jaw. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone measured, controlled. But the man wasn't interested in pleasantries. He took another step closer, ignoring the security team that immediately flanked him. "I'm not going to ask again," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Now, where is the baby?" Malik's stomach clenched. His fingers gripped the wooden railing of the staircase as he processed the man's words. The baby. He had assumed Olivia was the child's mother. Why else would she have reacted the way she did the night before? But this man spoke with certainty, with the kind of authority that made it clear he wasn't just speculating. Malik leaned in slightly, his breathing shallow as he tried to catch every word. Olivia, however, remained unmoved. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly. "You need to leave before this gets worse for you." The man laughed, but there was nothing amused about it. "For me?" He shook his head, his eyes dark, with something Malik couldn't quite place. "You think I don't know what's going on? You think I don't see what you're trying to do?" He exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with barely contained frustration. "This isn't over, Olivia. That child doesn't belong to you, and we both know it." His gaze flickered toward the security guards, who had subtly adjusted their stance, ready to intervene. "You can hide behind them all you want, but the truth is going to come out. And when it does, I guarantee you won't be able to talk your way out of it." Olivia's mask of indifference cracked just slightly, the smallest flicker of something behind her eyes, concern, hesitation, maybe even fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold expression she had worn when she first answered the door. "Escort him out," she said, her voice sharp, final. The security guards stepped forward in unison, their presence an unspoken warning. The man didn't resist, but as he turned to leave, he cast one last look over his shoulder. "You can't keep him forever," he muttered. Then, without another word, he stepped outside, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. Malik barely realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. Who was that man? Why was he so certain Olivia had taken the baby? And why hadn't she denied it outright? Everything about this felt wrong. The tension in the house didn't fade once the man was gone. If anything, it thickened. Olivia remained frozen in place for a long moment, her fingers clenching and unclenching at her sides. Then, without warning, she turned on her heel and walked briskly toward her office, her heels clicking against the polished floor with purpose. Malik hesitated before following, moving quietly along the upper level, keeping to the shadows. When she reached her office, she shut the door behind her, but Malik could still see the faint glow of light underneath. He crept closer, pressing himself against the wall just beside the doorway. A second later, he heard her voice, low, urgent. She was on the phone. "He showed up," she said, her words clipped. "I told you this would happen sooner or later." A pause. Then more forcefully, "No, we don't have time for that. We need to handle this now before it gets out of control." Another silence, shorter this time. "I don't care what it takes. Just make sure this doesn't come back to me." Malik's pulse hammered in his ears. He had no idea what she was talking about, but every instinct in his body told him that whatever it wasn't good. He took a careful step back, his mind churning with everything he had just heard. The man had said the baby didn't belong to her. Olivia had refused to deny it, and now she was making urgent calls to handle something. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but one thing was clear. There were secrets in this house, and he had just stumbled into the middle of them. Malik had been restless all night. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the confrontation at the door, the sharp words exchanged between Olivia and the unknown man, the way she had refused to deny his accusations, how she had reinforced the security of the house immediately after, and that phone. Call, handle this now before it gets out of control. Every instinct in his body screamed that something wasn't right. Lying on the bed in the room they had given him, he stared at the ceiling, his muscles tensed as if waiting for an unseen threat. He needed answers. Staying in the dark wasn't an option. He had spent too many years on the streets learning that ignorance could get you killed. If Olivia was involved in something dangerous, he had to know what it was before it was too late. Sliding out of bed as quietly as possible, he moved across the room, his bare feet soundless against the polished floor. He had memorized the way to Olivia's office from his explorations earlier in the day. He had seen her enter it several times, but had never seen the door left open for long. Whatever she kept in there, she didn't want prying eyes on it. That alone was enough to make him curious. Careful to avoid the floorboards that creaked slightly near the hallway entrance, he made his way toward the darkened corridor. The house was unnervingly silent at this hour, as if it held its breath along with him. When he reached the office, he was surprised to see the door slightly ajar. He stood, still for a moment, listening. No movement inside, no voices, no indication that anyone was near. Slowly, he pressed a hand against the door and eased it open just enough to slip inside. The room was dimly lit, the glow from a desk lamp casting long shadows over stacks of papers and books. The scent of leather and ink filled the air, mixing with the faint trace of Olivia's perfume. Malik scanned the room quickly, his eyes locking onto a pile of documents scattered across the desk. Whatever Olivia had been dealing with before heading to bed, she had left in a hurry. Moving closer, he began, sifting through the papers, careful to keep them in order. At first, most of what he saw seemed unimportant. Financial statements, letters, business dealings that didn't concern him. But then, buried beneath the pile, he found something that made his breath hitch. A file labeled with a name he didn't recognize. Flipping it open, he skimmed through its contents, his pulse quickening as he processed what he was looking at. It was an adoption file, and not just any adoption. This was about the baby. His fingers gripped the edges of the paper as he read the details, his stomach twisting as he noticed certain inconsistencies. Some of the signatures looked off, uneven, as if someone had hesitated before writing them. Certain dates had been crossed out and rewritten. There were gaps where there shouldn't be, missing records, a paper trail that didn't quite add up. He wasn't an expert in legal documents, but even he could tell that something wasn't right. He turned to the last page where the finalization of the adoption should have been legally confirmed. His heart pounded at what he saw, a missing seal of approval. A legitimate adoption wouldn't be missing that. This wasn't just a mistake. This looked deliberate. Someone had tampered with these papers. His mouth went dry as a sickening thought took root in his mind. Had the baby been taken illegally? The man from earlier had seemed so sure that Olivia had no right to the child. Malik had assumed it was some kind of custody battle, a legal dispute between families. But if these documents were forged, if they had been altered, then this was something far worse. This wasn't a battle between relatives. This was a cover-up, a theft disguised as a legal process. A floorboard creaked outside the office, making his entire body go rigid. His breath caught in his throat as he carefully set the papers back down, exactly how he had found them. The hallway outside was silent again, but that sound hadn't been his imagination. Someone was out there. He moved swiftly, closing the file and straightening the stack of documents as best he could. He turned toward the door, hesitating for a fraction of a second. If he left now and ran into someone, what excuse would he have? He had no right to be in here. They would know he had seen something. His fingers hovered over the desk for a second longer before he turned toward the shadows, making his way toward the door as silently as possible. He pressed his ear against it, listening. Still nothing. Slowly, he eased it open just a crack, just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He could feel it creeping up his spine, the unmistakable sensation of eyes in the dark. He knew better than to ignore it. Slipping out of the office, he made his way back toward his room, forcing himself to keep his steps light. He didn't look back, didn't give himself the chance to hesitate. Once inside his room, he locked the door behind him, his chest rising and falling in quick breaths. His mind was racing, piecing everything together. The baby hadn't been adopted legally. Olivia had been hiding something, and someone else in this house had been awake, watching him. Lying back on the bed, he stared up at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't know what Olivia was involved in, but he had just uncovered something that he wasn't supposed to see. He had gotten too close to the truth, and he had the distinct feeling that very soon someone was going to make sure he stayed quiet. Malik moved swiftly through the mansion, his breath tight in his chest, his mind still reeling from what he had discovered in Olivia's office. The adoption papers were fake. He had no doubt about that now. Olivia had altered documents, erased dates, and signed off on something that was never meant to be legal. The baby didn't belong to her. The man who had shown up at the house had been right. She had taken the child under false pretenses. But the biggest question remained. Who did the baby really belong to? Malik had no connections, no power, no authority to challenge her. But he had instincts, and they screamed that he needed answers. He couldn't get them inside that house. He needed to leave now. He waited for a moment of stillness before making his move. The security presence had increased ever since the confrontation at the door, and Olivia had been making phone calls late. Into the night, she was planning something. He could feel it. But the guards were human. They had patterns, breaks in their focus. When one turned a corner and another was distracted near the main gate, Malik took his chance. He ducked low, slipping through the garden's outer pathway, avoiding the areas with motion lights. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached the side entrance of the property. A tall fence loomed ahead, but he had climbed worse. His fingers gripped the metal bars, and he pulled himself up, swinging over and landing on the other side with practiced ease. For the first time in days, he was outside the mansion, but he wasn't safe yet. Keeping his head down, he walked quickly, taking random turns to make sure he wasn't being followed. The further he got from the wealth and excess of Olivia's world, the more familiar the streets became. He recognized the broken sidewalks, the abandoned storefronts, the alleys where people disappeared when they had nowhere else to go. It didn't take long for him to find the area he was looking for, a section of the city where those without homes gathered, seeking shelter in makeshift camps and forgotten doorways. He scanned the clusters of people huddled in the shadows, looking for someone who might know something, someone who had been around long enough to hear things others ignored. It was near a dimly lit alley that he found him. A hunched figure wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, his weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of an old cap. Malik's approach was cautious, but when he stopped a few feet away, the old man lifted his head slightly, his eyes sharp despite his worn-out appearance. "You looking for something, kid?" His voice was rough, but not unkind. Malik hesitated for a split second, then took the crumpled document from his pocket, the one with the name of the baby's supposed biological mother. He unfolded it, held it out. "Do you know this name?" The old man squinted at the paper, his lined face unreadable for a moment. Then his expression changed, his eyes widened, his fingers, his twitched slightly. He looked up at Malik, and his voice came out low, almost disbelieving. "Where did you get this?" Malik's heart pounded. He had been right to come here. This man knew something. He glanced around quickly, making sure no one else was paying attention, then took a step closer. "She's supposed to be the baby's mother," he said, keeping his voice steady, "but I don't think she ever agreed to give him up." The old man exhaled sharply, running a rough hand over his beard. He shook his head. "She wouldn't have, not willingly." Malik's stomach tightened. He needed to know more. "Who is she?" he pressed. The old man looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Her name's Maria," he said finally. "She's been gone for a while now, vanished. But before she disappeared, she was trying to fight something. Said someone was trying to take her kid away from her, but she didn't. Have money, no power, no one listened." He let out a bitter laugh. "Then one day she was just gone. No one saw her again." Malik felt his breath catch in his throat. Maria had fought to keep her baby, and now she had vanished. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him. This wasn't just an illegal adoption. It was something worse. Before Malik could ask another question, a shift in the air made him freeze. He wasn't sure what had tipped him off. The unnatural stillness, the subtle movement in the corner of his vision, but his instincts screamed danger. He turned his head, slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of two figures standing at the far end of the alley, dark suits, still, watching. The old man noticed them at the same time. His grip tightened on Malik's arm. "You need to go," he said urgently. "Now!" Malik's pulse spiked. He didn't know who they were, but he didn't need to. If they were watching him, if they had followed him here, it meant he was already in deeper than he had planned. And now he had a choice: run or stay and face what was coming. Malik didn't think. He acted. The moment the old man's grip tightened on his arm, he knew they were in danger. He turned on his heel and sprinted, pulling the old man with him, his heart pounding with the certainty that if they hesitated for even a second, they wouldn't get another chance. The two men in suits had begun moving toward them, their strides purposeful, their hands hovering near their sides, ready for something. Malik had seen enough in his life to recognize that kind of readiness. It wasn't just curiosity, it was control. These men weren't just there to watch, they were there to make sure something or someone didn't leave. He yanked the old man into a narrow alleyway, his mind racing. They needed to disappear, and fast. The old man stumbled slightly, but to his credit, he kept up. "Where are we going?" the old man rasped, his breath labored. Malik didn't answer right. "Away!" His brain was too busy calculating routes, figuring out which corners to turn to shake their pursuers. He had spent years on the streets. He knew which places to avoid, which alleys led to dead ends, which ones twisted and turned enough to lose someone who wasn't used to moving in the dark. The city had always been his maze, and tonight that knowledge was the only thing keeping them alive. After cutting through 3 different alleys, doubling back through a narrow passage between buildings, and slipping behind an overflowing dumpster, Malik finally spotted what he had been searching for: a shelter hidden between 2 rundown buildings, its entrance barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. He pushed the old man inside, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they hadn't been followed. The streets behind them were empty, at least for now. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself. to slow his breathing. They weren't safe yet, but they had bought themselves a little time. Inside, the shelter was dimly lit. Rows of worn-out cots lined against the walls, some occupied by sleeping figures wrapped in thin blankets. A few people sat hunched over at a table in the corner, murmuring quietly amongst themselves. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, unwashed clothes, and something Malik couldn't quite place. Maybe exhaustion, maybe desperation. He guided the old man to a seat and crouched in front of him. "Talk," Malik said, his voice urgent but quiet. "Tell me everything you know." The old man rubbed his hands together, his fingers shaking slightly. Whether from adrenaline or age, Malik couldn't tell. He swallowed, then looked up, his eyes filled with something that Malik recognized: grief. "Maria never wanted to give up her baby," he began. "She loved that boy more than anything, but she was alone, no money, no family. And then someone came along offering help, said they'd take care of everything, give her a place to stay, food, a chance to get back on her feet. She believed them." He shook his head. "But it was a lie." Malik leaned in, absorbing every word. "What happened? They tricked her," the old man continued, his voice raw. "They made her sign papers she didn't understand, told her it was just temporary, just to prove she could be responsible, that it was all part of the process." He exhaled, a sound filled with bitterness. By the time she realized what she had signed, it was too late. They took the baby, and when she started asking questions, started making noise, she disappeared. Malik's chest tightened. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it like this made it real in a way that sent ice through his veins. "Who took him?" he asked, his voice low, steady. The old man hesitated, then glanced toward the shelter entrance, as if expecting someone to burst through at any second. He lowered his voice. "I don't know who was behind it, but I know who ended up with the baby." His eyes met Malik's. "That woman, the one you're staying with." The confirmation hit Malik like a punch to the gut, even though he had already suspected it. Olivia had lied. She had stolen a child, using legal tricks and manipulation, and now she was willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried. Malik clenched his fists. He had to get out of there. He had to figure out a way to get to Maria, if she was even still alive. A sudden shift in the atmosphere made Malik's skin prickle. Something wasn't right. The shelter had been quiet, the low murmur of conversations in the background blending into the space like a constant hum. But now there was nothing. The air felt charged, like the moment before something went terribly wrong. Malik turned his head slowly toward the entrance and froze. A figure stood in the doorway. A man in a dark suit, perfectly pressed, his posture casual, but his presence anything but. His eyes scanned the room, then locked onto Malik and the old man. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message was clear. They had been found. Malik's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. Not yet. The old man was beside him, breathing heavily, and Malik knew he wouldn't be able to move as fast. He had to think fast. He looked around, searching for exits, for anything that could buy them time. But before he could act, the man in the doorway took a slow, deliberate step inside. They weren't getting out of this without a fight. Malik pushed open the massive doors of the mansion, his pulse a steady drum in his ears. He had run all the way back, his legs aching, his breath ragged. But none of that mattered now. He wasn't going to sit in the shadows any longer. Olivia had lied. She had stolen that baby from his real mother, tricking her into signing something she didn't understand. Malik wasn't a fool. He knew the difference between right and wrong, even if the world had never shown him much mercy. And this was wrong. He stormed through the polished floors, his torn sneakers leaving faint marks on the pristine marble. Olivia was waiting. She always was. She stood at the foot of the grand staircase, composed as ever, her hands clasped in front of her. She had changed since he had left. Her fitted dress was smooth, unwrinkled, as if she hadn't been up all night making phone calls to keep her crime buried. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes flicked over him, taking in the dirt on his clothes, the tension in his jaw, the fire in his eyes. "Malik," she said, her voice level. "I was wondering when you'd be back." He didn't waste time. "I know what you did," he snapped, stepping closer, fists clenched. "Maria never gave up that baby. You took him from her." Olivia's expression didn't change. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. Instead, she exhaled softly, tilting her head just slightly. "And what exactly do you think you know?" she asked, as if speaking to a child who had just stumbled upon a half-truth. "That baby was abandoned, Malik. Maria was in no condition to raise him. She was sick, unstable. She signed those papers because she knew she couldn't take care of him." Malik shook his head. "That's a lie," he spat. "She didn't choose to give him up. She was tricked. You made her. Don't think she had no choice." Olivia took a step forward now, her presence unnervingly calm. "What would you have done then?" she asked, eyes locked on his. "Would you have left him there in a shelter? A child with no future, no safety, no one to protect him?" She shook her head slowly. "I saved him. Malik, I gave him a life, one his mother never could." Malik felt his chest tighten. It was the way she said it, the way she made it sound so rational, so justified. He had spent his entire life knowing what it felt like to be unwanted, to be tossed aside. Olivia's words had weight he couldn't deny. That, but there was something else, something beneath her carefully controlled voice, something she wasn't saying. He had heard Maria's story. She had fought for her son. She had loved him, and now she was gone, just like that. Olivia didn't just take the baby, she erased Maria. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "You don't get to decide who deserves a family," he said, voice tight. "That wasn't your choice to make." Olivia studied him, her silence stretching just long enough to make his stomach twist. Then finally, she sighed. "And yet, here you are," she murmured. "A boy with no home, no family, nowhere to go. And you're angry because I did for that baby what no one ever did for you." Her words hit their mark. Malik felt them sink in, sharp and deep, but he refused to flinch. He wanted to believe she was wrong, that what she had done was monstrous. But then why was it so hard to argue? His fingers dug into the fabric of his jacket, gripping it like a lifeline. He had spent years wanting what that baby now had, a home, security, someone to fight for him. But at what cost? Could he really turn a blind eye, pretend he hadn't seen the truth? He swallowed hard, his head, his lowering for just a moment. His fingers brushed against something in his pocket, something stiff, something unfamiliar. He frowned, reaching in and pulled it out. A folded piece of paper. His pulse spiked as he carefully unfolded it, scanning the handwritten words inside. "She's still alive. Find her before it's too late." His breath caught. His eyes darted up to Olivia, who was still watching him closely, unaware of what he had just found. His fingers clenched around the note. Maria was alive. That changed everything. He had a choice to make, and this time, it wasn't just about what was right or wrong, it was about doing something. He took a slow step back, nodding slightly. "Maybe you're right," he said carefully. Olivia's gaze sharpened. He forced himself to hold steady. "Maybe that baby is better off here." He tucked the note into his pocket, keeping his movements measured. He couldn't let her see what he had found. Not yet. Olivia exhaled, relaxing just slightly. "I knew you'd understand," she murmured. "You're not as different from me as you think, Malik." He forced a smile, though his chest was tight. "Yeah," he lied. "I guess not." But even as he said it, he knew exactly what he had to do. Malik barely waited until he was out of Olivia's sight before he unfolded the note again, his fingers tightening around the fragile piece of paper. "She's still alive. Find her before it's too late." The words burned into his mind, setting a fire inside him that refused to be extinguished. If Maria was alive, if she had survived whatever Olivia had done to silence her, then he couldn't hesitate. He had to find her, and he had to do it before Olivia realized that he knew the truth. He moved quickly, exiting through the side of the mansion where the security presence was thinner. He had studied their patterns, memorized the way they rotated their positions. He ducked low, keeping close to the hedges as he slipped past the outer perimeter. Once he was far enough, he took off running, his breath sharp and quick. He needed to get to the city. The note hadn't given an exact location, but he had an idea of where to start. The old man from the shelter had told him Maria had disappeared, but people like Maria didn't just vanish. Someone had to know where she was, and Malik was willing to tear through every dark alley, every forgotten corner of the city to find her. His search led him to a shelter on the outskirts of town, a place barely standing, with broken windows covered by cardboard and the faint sound of murmured conversations coming from inside. He stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. The air was thick with exhaustion. People hunched over in corners, avoiding eye contact, carrying the weight of lives too heavy for their bodies. A woman sat near the back, her head lowered, her fingers trembling against the thin blanket draped over her lap. Malik knew before she even looked up. This was her. Maria's eyes were hollow, dark circles beneath them painting the picture of a woman who had lost everything. When she saw Malik, her body tensed. He took a slow step forward, not wanting to scare her. "I know who you are," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "and I know what they did to you." Her breath caught, and her fingers curled into the blanket. For a moment, she looked like she might run, but then something in her expression shifted, recognition, realization. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the one who saved your son," Malik answered. He hadn't meant for his voice to break on the last word, but it did, because suddenly it wasn't just about the baby, it was about him. He had been that kid once, the one no one came back for, the one who had been told that the world had decided his fate. But this baby still had a chance, and he wasn't going to let Olivia take that away. Maria's breath came out in a shudder. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "He's alive," she choked out. "He's really alive." Malik nodded, his throat thick. "And I can take you to him, but we don't have much time." Maria didn't hesitate after that. She stood, weaker than she should have been, but there was something in her. Now, something fierce, something that had been buried under months of loss and despair. Hope. Malik grabbed her hand, steadying her, and together they moved. Getting back into the mansion was harder. Olivia had doubled the security, and there was no way Malik could slip in unnoticed this time. But he wasn't trying to be unnoticed. He wanted Olivia to see him. He walked straight up to the gate, Maria beside him, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted in defiance. When the guards spotted them, they reacted instantly, moving to block their path. "I need to see Olivia," Malik said, keeping his voice steady. "Now!" One of the guards spoke into a radio, and moments later the mansion doors opened. Olivia stepped out, her posture poised, her face unreadable, but her eyes flickered when she saw Maria. It was brief, but Malik caught it. A moment of shock, of calculation. Then she smiled, calm, composed. "Well," she murmured, "I wasn't expecting this." Maria took a step forward, her voice raw but steady. "Give me back my son." Olivia didn't react at first. Then she tilted her head slightly, her eyes settling on Maria with something that almost resembled pity. "You're mistaken," she said, smoothly. "You signed the papers. You agreed. You tricked me." Maria interrupted, her voice rising. "You lied. You took him from me." Malik saw the guards shift slightly, ready for Olivia's command. He clenched his fists. If she gave the order, there was nothing he could do to stop them. But Olivia wasn't done yet. "And what exactly do you plan to do now?" she asked Maria, her voice gentle, like she was speaking to a child who didn't understand the weight of the situation. "Take him back? With what money? What home? What future?" Maria flinched, but Malik stepped in. "That's not a choice to make," he said, his voice cold. "You don't get to decide who deserves a family." Olivia sighed, as if disappointed. "I was hoping you'd see reason, Malik," she murmured. "I thought you, of all people, would understand." Maria reached for his arm, gripping it. "Where is he?" she demanded. Olivia studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, she turned to one of the guards and nodded. A door at the far end of the mansion opened. A nanny stepped out, cradling a small child in her arms. Malik's breath hitched. It was him, the baby. Maria let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer, her hands flying to her mouth. But before she could move, Olivia raised a hand. The guards instantly stepped forward, blocking the exit. Olivia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You came all this way," she mused, "but I don't think you've thought through how this ends." Malik's pulse roared in his ears. They were trapped. The baby was just a few feet away, but Olivia wasn't going to let them walk out that door. And now, he had to decide what he was willing to risk to change that. The tension in the mansion was suffocating. The baby was within reach, but Olivia's guards had closed in, blocking every possible exit. Malik could hear Maria's breathing beside him, ragged, uneven, fear and desperation rolling off her in waves. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now, after everything, Olivia was standing between her and her child, with nothing but cold confidence and an army of hired muscle. Malik knew Olivia thought she had won. She had played the game too long, manipulated too many people to believe that she could ever lose. But Malik had seen what real loss looked like, and he wasn't about to let it happen again. His mind raced. The odds were stacked against them, but he had survived worse. Olivia's men were trained, sure, but they were used to intimidation, not unpredictability. That was his advantage. He glanced at Maria, her hands clenched at her sides. She had the will, but not the strength. It was up to him. He met Olivia's gaze, forcing himself to stay calm. "You don't want this to end like this," he said, his voice level but firm. "You think you're protecting him, but all you're doing is proving that you don't deserve him." Olivia arched a brow, unimpressed. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it, Malik?" Before he could answer, the sharp wail of sirens shattered the tension. Blue and red lights flickered through the windows, casting fractured reflections across the polished floors. Olivia's expression faltered for the first time, her eyes snapping toward the entrance. The police. Malik hadn't called them, but someone had. And judging by the way Olivia's guards exchanged uncertain glances, they weren't ready for this either. The moment of hesitation was all Malik needed. He grabbed Maria's wrist and bolted. Chaos erupted. Olivia's voice rang out, commanding her men to stop them, but they were already moving, weaving through the hall, dodging the hands that reached for them. Malik had spent years learning how to navigate the world unseen, slipping through cracks that no one else noticed. Now, he moved with purpose, dragging Maria toward the one place Olivia's power couldn't touch. Outside, the doors burst open just as the first police officers stepped onto the property. They barely had time to react before Maria's frantic voice rang out. "He's mine! They stole him from me!" Everything happened at once. Officers moved in, their presence forcing Olivia's men to step back. More cars pulled up, and suddenly the mansion that had once been Olivia's fortress was swarming with law enforcement. Malik didn't know who had tipped them off, but it didn't matter. The truth had caught up to Olivia, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. Maria ran forward, reaching the nanny who still held her baby. For a moment the woman hesitated, glancing back as if waiting for Olivia's command. But Olivia had gone still, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The nanny, perhaps realizing she was on the wrong side of this, gently handed the baby over. Maria crumpled, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her son against her chest. Malik watched as relief and grief collided in her expression, months of suffering melting into one overwhelming moment. He felt something loosen inside him, something that had been wound so tightly for so long that he hadn't even realized it was there. He had done it. He had saved them. But now, as he stood there, watching Maria cry into her son's soft curls, a sharp truth settled over him. They had a home to return to. He didn't. As the officers moved to question Olivia, Malik took a slow step back. The fight was over, and yet the familiar weight of uncertainty returned to his chest. He had nowhere to go. The streets were always waiting, but after everything he had been through, after everything he had done, going back felt different now, empty. He turned, ready to slip away before anyone noticed, but a rough hand landed on his shoulder. He tensed, spinning instinctively, only to meet the old man's knowing gaze. "You're not just going to walk off, are you?" the old man asked, his tone laced with amusement, but his eyes sharp. Malik hesitated. He had never been the type to stay. Staying meant attachments, expectations, things that never lasted. The old man seemed to read his mind because he chuckled, shaking his head. "Boy, you think you don't belong anywhere, but I've seen enough to know that ain't true." He nodded. Toward the city, the distant skyline reflecting the remnants of the chaos they had just escaped. "There are more kids out there like you, like that baby, lost, scared, thinking no one's coming for them. You could help them." Malik swallowed hard, his fists clenching at his sides. The idea of purpose, of choosing to be something more than a survivor, felt too big, too unreal. But at the same time, wasn't that what he had been doing all along? He had fought for that baby like no one had ever fought for him. He had risked everything to uncover the truth. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to disappear back into the streets. Maybe he was meant to stay. His gaze drifted back to Maria, who was now rocking her son gently, whispering words only meant for him. He had done what he set out to do. He had given her a second chance. Maybe now it was time to take his own. He turned back to the old man, exhaling slowly. "Where do we start?" he asked. The old man's grin widened. "Now that," he said, clapping Malik's shoulder, "is the right question." Malik looked at the city one last time, letting the moment settle inside him. He had spent his life running from people, from pain, from the past. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was walking towards something. And even though he didn't know exactly where it would lead, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. What a touching story, right? Here at Living Narratives, every story is crafted with care to touch your heart and bring meaningful reflections. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Leave your comment below. Your thoughts are very important to us. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It really helps us keep bringing inspiring stories like this one. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you for being part of our journey, and see you in the next chapter.